Imagine a remote hotel in the New Hampshire mountains, 1944. Delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel for the Bretton Woods Conference, not to fight a battle, but to win the future. The agenda? Who holds the financial crown? For over 2 centuries, it was Britain, but her national debt, post-World War II, had swelled to a crippling 240 to 270% of GDP. The British pound was exhausted, and in that room, the delegates officially transferred global financial power from the pound sterling to the US dollar. This wasn't a historical anomaly. It was the latest chapter in a 500-year cycle that every reserve currency has followed. To understand where the dollar is going, we must revisit the 4 empires that fell before it. The history of global finance is not a steady line of progress. The setting was the secluded, majestic Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where delegates from 44 allied nations gathered to determine the post-war financial order. The most consequential decision they faced was the fate of the British pound sterling. For over 2 centuries, the pound had been the undisputed anchor of international trade. But Great Britain, despite victory in the Second World War, was financially depleted. By 1945, its national debt had soared to an astonishing 270% of its GDP, primarily financed by massive borrowing, notably through the U.S. Lend-Lease Act, which created post-war debt obligations that Britain would be repaying until 2006. In that quiet mountain resort, the torch of global financial authority was formally transferred from the exhausted British Empire to the ascendant United States dollar. This pivotal moment was merely the 5th repetition of a pattern that began 5 centuries earlier, a relentless cycle that averages roughly 95 years per dominant currency. The cycle's first true progenitor was the Portuguese real, active from 1450 through 1580. Portugal's dominance was forged not in silver or brute force, but through technological innovation and maritime mastery. The catalyst was the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, which effectively severed the lucrative overland silk and spice trade routes to the east. Portugal invested heavily in cartography and shipbuilding, perfecting the shallow draft, versatile catavel, and pioneering the open ocean sailing technique known as the Volta do Mar, literally turn of the sea. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, the Portuguese real became the currency of the Estado de India, backed by the unparalleled control of global spice distribution. Lisbon's Casa de India, or India House, became the royal trade hub, dictating European commodity prices. However, success led to overextension, as Portugal maintained an expensive network of over 50 widely scattered feitorias, or fortified trading posts, across 4 continents. The fatal blow was political, a profound leadership vacuum caused by the death of young King Sebastian I at the disastrous Battle of Quexar el Kebir in Morocco. With no immediate heir, Spain's Philip II asserted his claim 2 years later, absorbing Portugal into the Iberian Union in 1580, ending the real's reign. The Spanish dollar, or the piece of 8, active from the 1530s to the 1640s, succeeded the real, its power rooted in geological luck. In 1545, the discovery of the Cerro Rico, or rich hill of Potosi in the Bolivian Andes, revealed the richest silver deposit in human history. The mountain's yield was so immense that it is estimated to have produced nearly half the world's silver between 1575 and 1635. The Spanish dollar, or Real de Ocho, minted with a high uniform silver content, rapidly became the first truly global currency. It was accepted from Europe to the Philippines and China, becoming so reliable that it served as legal tender in the United States until the Coinage Act of 1857. The coin's design, featuring the Pillars of Hercules wrapped in a banner with the motto Plus Ultra, meaning more beyond, symbolized Spain's boundless reach. But this silver flood was an economic curse. The Spanish Habsburg monarchs, primarily Philip II, used the wealth not for productive investment, but for funding ceaseless European wars like the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands and the Campaign of the Armada. This influx caused the price revolution, a massive, persistent inflation that quadrupled prices across Spain, crippling its domestic economy. The debt burden grew untenable, leading Philip II to default on his loans 4 separate times in 1577, 1560, 1575, and 1596, shattering the crown's credibility. When the Potosi silver supply naturally tapered off in the 17th century, the over-indebted, unproductive Spanish Empire quickly lost its monetary dominance, a decline formally acknowledged by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. A different kind of power rose next, the Dutch guilder, active from 1640 through 1720. The small Dutch Republic compensated for its lack of natural resources with financial innovation and trade efficiency, establishing Amsterdam as the world's leading financial hub. Their currency, the guilder or florin, was backed by systems, not just specie. They founded the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609, an early precursor to a central bank, which created a bank money, almost a form of fiat money, to standardize payments and eliminate the chaos of worn, clipped coins. Crucially, the Dutch pioneered modern capitalism itself by creating the world's first continuously trading stock exchange and issuing the first publicly traded shares and bonds for the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. The VOC was a global enterprise of unprecedented scale, capable of financing its own wars and maintaining its own armies. The guilder was Europe's de facto reserve currency for almost a century, but the constant need to defend their wealth proved fatal. Overextension manifested as continuous geopolitical conflict, notably the 4 intense Anglo-Dutch wars. The massive cost of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which took place from 1780 through 1784, and the demand for emergency funding for the cash-strapped VOC forced the Bank of Amsterdam to implement destabilizing policies, including a sudden 9% attempted devaluation of its money relative to silver, exposing its lack of fiscal underpinning and causing a swift, sharp loss of global confidence. The British pound sterling, dominant from 1720 through 1944, then inherited the mantle, enjoying the longest run of any modern reserve currency. Britain's rise was powered by the Industrial Revolution and the absolute global dominance of the Royal Navy, which secured every major trade route. The pound's credibility was solidified by the Great Recoinage of 1816, which formally established the gold standard in Britain. This mechanism fixed the price of an ounce of gold at £4.25 and guaranteed convertibility, assuring investors that the pound was the most stable and trustworthy currency on earth. At its zenith, over 60% of world trade was invoiced in sterling, and by 1922, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. This was a true peak dominance. The familiar crack of overextension, however, came in the form of total war. World War I exploded national debt, forcing the UK off the gold standard temporarily. World War II was the fatal blow. The sheer cost of fighting brought debt to GDP to 270%, reserves were exhausted, and the empire, though victorious, was forced to accept a subordinate financial role to the one nation whose industrial base had survived the conflict intact, the United States. That brings us to the present, the US dollar, dominant from 1944 to the present. The U.S. emerged from World War II holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, the foundation upon which the Bretton Woods Agreement was built, pegging every major currency to the dollar and the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. This system reigned supreme until 1971, when President Richard Nixon, facing massive foreign exchange of dollars for gold due to the cost of the Vietnam War and domestic programs, unilaterally suspended convertibility, the infamous Nixon shock. The gold standard was finished. Yet, the dollar did not collapse because it found a new anchor: oil. Following the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, the U.S. struck a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia in 1974 to price all Saudi oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars in exchange for military protection. By 1975, this was extended to all OPEC members, creating the petrodollar system. Because every country needs oil, every country needs dollars, guaranteeing permanent, artificial, global demand. This dominance allowed the U.S. to run perpetual trade deficits and finance a massive global military footprint of over 900 bases in 130 countries, a textbook case of overextension. Today, the dollar is 81 years into its run, and the cycle is repeating. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has declined from over 70% in 2000 to the mid-50s by the mid-2020s. U.S. public debt stands at approximately $36.4 trillion, exceeding 124% of GDP. Most significantly, de-dollarization is accelerating as geopolitical rivals like the BRICS nations, which have expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others, are actively bypassing the dollar through bilateral trade agreements and developing alternative mechanisms, such as the proposed BRICS bridge payment system, specifically to limit the U.S.'s ability to weaponize the dollar through sanctions. The historical pattern of rise, peak, and overextension is complete, and the final stage of reckoning is now approaching, raising the question of whether the next transition will be a sharp collapse like the Dutch guilders or a slow, multipolar shift where the dollar shares power with emerging currencies, ending the age of single reserve currency dominance.